Welcome, everyone, to another Typology in the Bible episode with our resident professor, Ken Mady. Ken, great to see you. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, I am so excited today. This is a really fun one. We're continuing in our typology study, and remember that is trying to learn the author's intent that we are going to see through what we're calling micro or macro patterns. That could either be events or particular words listed in order, things like that. That gives us typology.
Okay.
So go back to the first video if you haven't seen that, kind of lays out a little bit of the groundwork. But today we're going to be in the idea of, or the type, the theming, I should say, of dry land. So we're kind of just working our way through Genesis. There are some really, really key, sometimes we say motifs or themes in the book of Genesis, and one of those is dry land. So looking forward to jumping into this. This is a really fun one.
All right.
So in Genesis chapter 1, of course, we see, and I want to also just clarify something real quick because we had somebody comment this in the last video, and they thought that I was saying that in Genesis chapter 1, that because we see in verse number 2, the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the waters in verse 2, um, because I was saying that we see this idea of the presence of God hovering over chaos, they thought that I was advocating for the gap theory or a pre-Adamic race, which I'm not advocating for that. Let me try to clarify. Water in the Hebrew mind is chaos. It's instability. In fact, since we have our screen sharing right now, let me just go over. I think I might have done this last time, but let me just go ahead and just make this note here in Psalm 69. David here in Psalm 69 is talking about this idea of chaos. And notice what he says. He says, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink deep in mire where there's no standing. I have come into deep waters where floods overflow me." And people can read the rest on their own. But the point is here in poetry, in the Hebrew mind, poetry, water is the idea of chaos and its instability. That's why we have the idea of Jesus being the solid rock. He's foundational. And so we get this theming. It's not that sin has entered, and here's another thing that I wanted to say as we get into typology, and we're still kind of in an introduction to typology. I mean, this is going to be such an amazing series we're doing. But one of the things we have to ask ourselves when we're getting into this is, what kind of story is the Bible sharing? I mean, what kind of story is this? You know, is it strictly a science book to tell you? Is it physics? Is this a physics book? Is it telling you about the physical world? Is that the story we're sharing? Or what kind of story is this? Now, certainly there's some physics in the story, but what kind of story is being shared? Like, what's the goal here? And I think that's something that everybody needs to wrestle with. I think that the story that's being told here is the Lord is telling us about the redemption of mankind through Jesus Christ. So that's the story that's being told here. For example, when we see these 7 days of creation, we sometimes say 6 days and then he rested,
Mhm.
except for it's the 7 days of creation because the resting is part of it. Because the idea of a rest is not from exhaustion. The word rest has to do with ruling.
Yeah, see,
And so,
I've just always thought it meant he was done and he just took the last day off of the week.
yeah, yeah, not at all. It's not for an example for us when we're working 40 hours a week and then spend time with family. The idea is that out of this chaos, he orders it. And after it's ordered, he rules over it.
Which which makes sense now that day 7 doesn't end with and the evening and the morning were the seventh day,
Right.
because it's an
Yeah.
ongoing thing. Is that
He,
right?
or he, yes. In other words, see, people will say, okay, so you then on day number 8 and then on day 14. No, he didn't. Day 7 wasn't created. Day 7 just happens.
Mhm.
He created life. He separates light from darkness. And this is not a biology. This is not a physics book or a science book. This is the story of an ordering God who orders his creation and then rules over his creation. That's what's being shared. That's the motif. And we see that. So when he calls the earth his footstool, it's talking about the idea of not just subduing it and not just having dominion over it, but ruling over it in the form of rest. Sitting on his throne is not just because his legs are tired. The idea of Jesus ascending to the throne and sitting at the right hand of the Father, it has the idea of authority and rulership, not tired.
Mm.
And so when we work through the days of creation, what we're seeing here is not so much for us to go and try to replicate things, but rather to understand that he's an ordering God who has authority over creation.
Okay.
That's what's being shared here. And so when I talk about the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the deep, the idea here in verse number 2 is that God's presence can be over chaos. That's not to say sin was there before Adam. We'll look at this later because if it's okay with you, Jimmy, and I haven't asked you this yet, but maybe if our next video could be the deep. This is kind of like a part 1, part 2 almost, because dry land is only dry land because it comes out of the deep. So
Yep. Verse
maybe
2.
the deep, yeah. So maybe the deep could be our next video because they go hand in hand.
Okay.
And I've really tried to not talk about the deep very much because the deep and the abyss, we see that word abyss in Revelation. It's the same word as the Hebrew word deep. So the dragon that's down in the abyss, that is the same idea as the deep. It's the exact same word actually.
Okay.
And so we see in creation, it gets translated in our version of English, it gets translated as creatures. There's creatures in the deep, but really in the Hebrew, that word creatures, one of those words has to do with sea monsters. So there's sea serpents in the original creation, sea monsters. Now they're not a result of sin, but they are sea serpents or sea monsters in the
Mm-hmm.
deep before sin. So you can't live with them, but there's no sin there yet.
Right.
So it's not I'm not talking about a pre-Adamic fallen sin nature. So the Spirit of God hovers over chaos. It doesn't mean due to sin. It means there's no stability, as we read in Psalm 69. And I'm sinking. That's why we want a sure foundation, a solid rock. And this paints the theme of righteousness being that rock of stability out of the chaos, out of the instability.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the typology. So we get over here to, let's just start our study then. And for dry land, we get over here to verse number 9. And over in verse number 9, Moses writes, Then God said, Let the waters under the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. Notice again, this is what God said. When God is speaking, the imagery here is that he's using words to speak. And so that's why it's through Christ that the creation of the world can be understood, even though the Father's here making it. Jesus isn't born until Bethlehem, but these are the words of God. Then God said, verse 9. And so then his word becomes flesh and dwells among us. So we can say that by him or through him, all things consist, because
Right.
that's the story. His words become flesh.
Mm.
So here we see this water is all gathered to one place, and then dry land appears. In verse number 10 says, And God called the dry land earth, and gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So this separation from land, or this separation from water, is land, and this dry land is earth. And God saw that that was good. Or here's another way I could say it. He didn't see that it was good in the sense of morality, like it was righteous. He saw that it was good in the sense of ordered. And if you order something, you have dominion over it. So he sees it in the sense of ordered, that he has control of. Verse 11. Then God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the tree and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. By the way, Remember when we talked about our Nephilim series, according to its kind, we see all the way through the creation story, after its kind, after its kind, after its kind,
Mm-hmm.
according to its kind. And that breaks theme. If the Nephilim are a half breed of demon, fallen demon, and human, it breaks the theming in Genesis. So just to point that out, that we're seeing these according to its kind, after its kind idea. And God saw that it was good, or God saw that it was ordered. This idea of being ordered under His rule. And the evening and the morning were the third day. So this dry land is the third day of creation. The sea being ordered, dry land separating it, and things begin to grow on it. So this is our theming. Now, from here, we see that this dry land idea is a safe harbor from the deep. It's power over the chaos of the waters. It's a safe place to go. And so we see this over and over again. So let's kind of start, let's have some fun here. Let's go over in actually the very next verse. Let me also point this out too, on the next chapter, excuse me. Let me point this out too, because if you get to Genesis chapter 2, don't forget, folks, as we're reading this, that in Genesis 2:7, that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground. So you and I are the dry land, right? We're made from the dry land.
Mm-hmm.
So, so, so from this dry land, his prized creation, mankind, Adam, and God breathes then his presence or his spirit or his wind, all the same word in the Hebrew, that ruach, that wind, breath, spirit, breathes it into the dry land, and that's when man becomes alive. And so, we haven't really got into anthropology too much, but Genesis 2:7 is foundational for biblical anthropology. Dry land plus God's breath equals alive. Now, you say, Ken, duh. I mean, obviously. No, not obviously, because most people don't agree with it.
Yeah.
Most Christians don't agree with it. So we'll get into that another time. But you'll notice that
Is this the soul conversation?
this is the soul
Okay.
conversation, because the biblical definition of soul is alive. You notice here the NKJV clarifies, and the NKJV here says the man became a living being, which is exactly what the KJV says. They didn't change anything. Soul means alive, it means life. So here's the equation: body plus breath equals alive, body minus breath equals death. Here, I'm going to say the same thing: body plus breath equals a living soul, body minus breath equals a not living soul, not a
Mm.
living person.
Yeah.
So that's biblical anthropology. What messed us up was Plato, that started teaching Greek philosophy, that says, no, 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 no. Your real person is called your soul, and it escapes your body at death. And now we got to put it somewhere. So the church got all screwy and tried to figure out where to put a soul. But keep it simple. We're made
Yeah.
out of dry land, and God's breath makes us alive.
I don't know if you remember this, but last year, or maybe it was within the first couple months of when we started uh, working together, we recorded an afterthought little clip because you were talking. Because
Mm.
just for the people watching, Ken and I always talk for a little bit after we're done with each episode, and sometimes we get into some deep stuff, and sometimes I go ahead and hit the record button again, and sometimes I tell him I'm doing that, sometimes I don't, but most of the time I tell him. But
That's
we
called
did,
spying, by the way.
but we recorded a little episode that I've never put out yet because I don't know if I've had enough nerve to do it or not. But
Mhm.
it was called Platonic Duality, is what you
Good.
called it. So
Okay. Yep.
so I do have that little video.
Yep.
If I get enough comments with interest in watching that, I might go ahead
Yeah.
and put that out right
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
this one.
That's the thing, man. It's like the ramifications from that study is eternal torment for the lost in hell? Or is it like the Bible says, and do they die a second death?
Mhm.
Are the wages of sin death or eternal torment? Are you kept alive forever burning, or do you die?
Mhm.
Is John 3:16 literal, or do we have to put definitions on life and death? I think it's literal. And so I can make that case. So this biblical anthropology has to do with um, what does it mean for us after we die? What does it mean for our loved ones who haven't embraced Christ as their savior? They don't follow him. What does it mean for them when they die? What's the
Yeah.
next steps? So all of that has to do with how you understand this biblical anthropology.
So you're saying that Plato, the Greek philosopher,
Hmm.
introduced, because the Greeks believed in, not only they believed in multiple gods to start with, right?
Right.
And
Right.
they believed in the souls going on and doing different things after, and that's where this whole thing started. You don't ever see this in the Old Testament anywhere.
No, in fact, the only place that you see that questioned is the snake in the
Mhm.
garden.
Mhm.
You shall not surely die.
Yeah.
That's the popular teaching in churches today. In fact, you see memes all over social media that say things like, it's not a matter of, how do they say it? It's not a matter of if you die, because basically everybody lives. It's a matter of location. Yeah, that's the popular teaching today, right? It's like if you don't
Mhm.
follow Christ, it's just a matter of where your location is going to be,
Right.
heaven or hell forever. Everyone lives forever. They might say it that way. Everyone lives forever. It's just a matter of where.
Yeah.
That is not the gospel. That is
Yeah.
not the gospel.
But
So yeah, it's
that is the way we're taught from
yep,
birth in my
that's
life,
right.
and
That's right. That's right.
so,
Yep.
but yeah, okay,
Jesus
so
didn't teach that. Yeah, so that's a little teaser. See who's interested.
okay,
I know.
okay,
I
yeah.
know.
Seriously, if I get enough comments requesting it, I'll go ahead and put it
Yeah.
out, and just watch it
Yeah.
for your consideration, if nothing else.
Just the way that I say it is, I don't want to get you in trouble, Jimmy, or anybody else. This is just how I say it.
It's
I'm
too late
happy
for
to.
that. It's way too late for that.
We're way past that part.
We're
Okay,
way past
but I
that.
but I would just say this in all seriousness, because I come on here and may teach. It doesn't mean that Jimmy you may not agree with 100%. I mean, I don't think anybody agrees with anybody 100%. So we don't have fellowship because we're saying we agree with each other 100%.
Yeah,
um so I could come on and share that. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's your view. At least you're showing people at least a view.
right.
So anyway, maybe that's a little teaser. I know, for those of you who also know Miss Tracy, I know she's been very interested in doing that topic, so maybe there's an interest out there. All right, well, let's move on in this dry land as well. Let's go to Genesis chapter 7. So, what we've established so far is we have the creation of the world, which is a beginning. In the creation of the world at the beginning, we see that there is a dry land idea. Um, and there's chaos. This water's chaos. God's spirit is there, hovers over the face of the deep, the abyss. And then we see in verse number 9, dry land appears out of the chaos. That's the idea we have. And it sort of marks a beginning. And the Lord, of course, forms man of that dry land, the dust. Dust, after all, is dry land.
Hmm.
That's exactly what Adam was formed out of.
Hmm.
And then, of course, we see the the Genesis 3:15 plot line, and the Lord looks at the serpent and he says to him, um, that the woman right there, pointing to Eve, her seed is going to come against your seed, which neither of them have seed. It means spiritually, because they neither of them have physical seed. And the seed from the woman, which ultimately will be Christ, is going to crush the head of the serpent and destroy him. So this is the plot line of the whole Bible.
Hmm.
And then we see, of course, as we've gone over in our Nephilim series, the intermingling and intermixing with the those that are in covenant with God. We're marrying those that were not in covenant and mixing it. And the Lord is like, well, we're in really bad shape here, guys. So what does he do? Okay, with our theming of dry land, he starts over. What did we start with? All water. What do we go back to? All water.
The flood.
The flood. Noah's flood in Genesis 7. So we're starting the story over again. So we go
Hmm.
over to Genesis chapter 7, look in verse 17. This is basically the creation story. Now read it with that in mind. The flood was on the earth 40 days. Now 40 becomes another typology, right? 40 is the number that we have in the Bible for trials or decision making. Goliath is mocking Israel for 40 days. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Make up your mind, guys. Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, 40 days. We have this 40 over and over again in decision making or temptation, that kind of idea. So the flood's only
And
with 40 days.
it took me at least till I was in my 40s before I started getting my act together too.
There you go. There you go. 40 was decision time for you too. And
Yeah.
also we see 40 years are between our Matthew 24 study and the destruction of the temple. Decision time. You got the book of Acts going. You got 40 years, guys. What's your decision? You can embrace the Messiah or not. So here we see in Genesis 7:17, and the flood was on the earth 40 days. The water increased and lifted up the ark. Now, we'll do this another time, but there's typology of the ark of being Jesus. This, you got to get in the ark, right? You got to get in Jesus. And that typology is used by Jesus. So we'll get into that another time. So that's
That
an
wouldn't
easy
be
one
the
because
that wouldn't be the Ark of the Covenant, would it?
well, the word does tie
Different.
together.
Mm.
The word does tie together, and I think that is meant to bring you back. We'll do ark as a typology in
Okay.
one video, but
Okay.
we also see Moses very specifically uses the word ark when he's talking about the basket that his mother made for him in the bulrushes. It says an ark in the bulrushes. Now, the NIV and some modern translations, they want to help the reader, and they change the word to basket. Doesn't help us. Moses used the word ark on purpose to
Mm.
tell to typology to say this is a new beginning, just like it was for Noah. Just
Mm.
as in Noah, you got to be in Moses to get in through the other side of this thing. Okay, you got to be baptized into Moses, as it says in Hebrews. But let's continue. Let's
Okay.
move on. So in verse 17, the waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. By the way, just like Jesus was lifted high above the earth. Same idea there. The waters prevailed. So we have a war going on. So going back to our study in Genesis 1, and this will piggyback with our next one with the deep study, which I'm hinting at in this, but we have to kind of touch on this. The deep is chaos. We understand that. And here the deep or the waters are prevailing. So chaos is prevailing, but the ark is above it. Okay, so the waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth. The ark moved about on the surface of the water. So there's this concept here with Noah's ark. There's total chaos, but Noah's rising above the chaos inside of the ark. Verse 19, and the waters prevailed. Again, the waters prevailed. So let's look at what we're looking at here. So in verse 17, waters increased. 18, waters prevailed. 19, waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth. There's a battle going on here between chaos and stability. And here, chaos is winning. All the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. Verse 20, just so you didn't miss it, waters prevailed. They're winning. 15 cubits upward, the mountains were covered. All the flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, cattle, beast, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. So that's a reversal of the Garden of Eden, a reversal of Genesis 2:7 of God making man from the dust. There is no dust right now.
Mm-hmm.
There's no dry land right now. Verse 22, all whose nostrils, whose breath of the spirit of life, that reminds us of Genesis 2:7 as well. Of the dry land, God formed the dust of Adam's body, and then he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And then it says it just so you don't miss it. All that was on the dry land died. So it's a reversal of that creation from Genesis 2:7. And remember, we read in that third day that grass would come forth and produce seed, and after its kind, that's all been reversed. Now we're back to where we were before day 3. We're back to just the water. Verse 23. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground. Again, it's the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things, and the bird of the air. So they were destroyed from the earth. There's another form of that, because remember what we read in chapter 1, that when the dry land appeared, it was called earth.
Mm-hmm.
Only Noah and these that were with him in the ark. So you got to be in the ark. So only does this reversal of creation, or sometimes in our Revelation series, we learn to call it decreation language. This is decreation language with one exception: those that are in the ark. See, the decreation language for the Old Covenant for our Revelation series, was going to apply to everybody was not in the salvation shelter in Christ. This is
I, s-
exactly what we're seeing here.
I still love that episode,
Yeah,
Salvation
good stuff.
Shelter. That's such a great
Yeah,
episode.
it's life changing. So as we finish up Genesis 7 in this chapter, notice the conclusion. And the waters prevailed on the earth. For how long? 150 days. But when we get to the next chapter,
Okay,
yep.
remember where you're at when we get to the
Okay.
next chapter. I just got something before we move on from the flood. This is a little bit off
Okay.
topic, but well, you know how in the New Testament, when we're reading through our Matthew 24, when we're reading through
Mhm.
Revelation, when it talks about the whole earth and the earth, it was always referring to the known world right there, that Rome and all. Is there any chance in your mind that this flood was just to the known area, or do you think it covered the whole face of the whole earth?
Yeah. So the question is basically localized
Yeah,
or universal, and I think it's universal
I mean, I do
because
too.
of yeah. If it's covering the highest mountain, and there's so many feet over it, then for me that would, no matter what your cosmology is of the Earth, it really doesn't matter what your cosmology is. That would cover the whole thing.
It would have to.
It would have to, yeah.
Okay.
Not only that, but there's evidences of a worldwide flood all over the place.
Hmm.
So you can see marine life on the top of mountains in Washington State. They're all over the world. I'm picking that because I'm from Washington. In fact, I'll tell you this. I was doing some yard work here in Central Florida, probably, um, I guess it would have been about 7 or 8 years ago. And I was digging down. I had to dig down. We bought a house that was out in the middle of nowhere, and I was digging down in my house in the yard to do something. I can't remember what it was for. Oh, I know what it was. We had a banana tree I didn't want, and its roots went down and down. I was digging this thing, and I was probably 3 feet down because this thing kept coming back, and I didn't want it. And I kept digging. I was probably 3 feet. I mean, I was in the ground with a shovel going like that, and I was up by like my thighs, and
I
I
just
hit something. And I went,
I just planted a banana tree.
did you? I wish I'd have given you mine. It was taking over everything. I couldn't kill it. So I was digging down. I hit something, and I went down, and I saw something shiny. I was like, "What on earth?" And I kept going like that, and I unearthed a conch shell, perfect conch shell. And I thought, and I went in. I said, "Look what I just found in our yard." And I told Sarah, I said, "What are the chances anybody in the history of the world?" And we were not in a subdivision. This was out in the country, this house at the time that we had. I was like, what are the chances of somebody out in the middle of this world was digging down 3 feet and put that there? I was like, this is from Noah's flood. So there is marine life all over the earth that's buried down.
Wow.
And here's another point I'll say real quickly. Remember this: a fossil is created when something alive is rapidly buried. So if a cow is in a field and a cow falls over, that doesn't create a fossil. Because when the sun hits it and the oxygen is there, it will make it into dust. Talking about dry land,
Mm.
that makes it into dust. The only way you'd have a fossil from that is if it's alive or it dies either way and is rapidly buried that day. So all of the living matter, all of the organic matter in that is covered with mud. So the fact that you have any fossils anywhere is evidence of a worldwide flood.
There you go.
So anyway, we can get into that a little
Just,
bit more later, but
just
yeah.
glad we have a professor here.
Well, don't try to get your money back. You get what you pay for. So you can drop this class anytime. Uh, in the next chapter in Genesis chapter 8, and going down at verse 13, when this thing comes to a close, look at the wording. It came to pass in the 601st year, um, in the first month, first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark, and look, there's another typology study, covering. Jesus is our covering of the earth, and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. Now, this is Moses' way of telling the reader, here's the dry land has once again appeared.
Mm.
So in verse 9, day 3, that's stability. Now, you know what's so stable about this dry land? All the ungodly are gone, fresh start. Instead of two people in the garden and they both fall from the serpent, now we have Noah who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He wasn't perfect, but he found grace. See the difference? He humbled himself and found grace in the eyes of the Lord. In Second Peter, it refers to Noah as a preacher of righteousness.
Mm.
So Noah is in covenant, and covenantally, so is his wife, 3 children, and their wives. So now we have 8 people. The Valley of Eight is that's
Mm.
named, by the way. If you go look at the Valley of Eight. So we have dry land. So it's a new start. We see this again. Let's go to Exodus chapter 14. In Exodus chapter 14, Moses is going to piggyback this idea. And if we look over at verses 21 and 22, this is going to be them getting away from Egypt. We all know the story, so I won't take the time for that. But you remember this, verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, just like the Spirit of God was over the deep. And the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night. Very interesting east wind. We should do a study on east wind.
Mm.
All that. That's pretty interesting too.
Yeah.
That's the directional. That's the entrance to the Garden of Eden. It's the entrance to the tabernacle is from the east. A lot of things coming in from the east. Very interesting.
You
By a
drew your
strong,
little entrance to the salvation shelter on the east too.
yeah. Well, that's good if I did that. I'm
You
not sure I
did.
thought through that. Did I? Oh,
You
okay. I
did.
wonder if I did that on purpose. I don't remember.
I think
Hope
you
I did.
did. I
That's
think you talked about that.
Did I? Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
okay. Well, I'm glad I was on that. To go back to East Wind all that night and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. Next verse says, so the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Now, what's interesting about this story is they're passing over on dry land, and that should trigger in our minds, oh, we've seen the dry land motif before. We've seen it in the creation story where God orders the chaos with dry land. We've seen it now again where Noah gets off the ark and now there's order on dry land. And now Moses says that he was saved as a child in an ark. And here we see a fresh start, a new chapter, a new
Mm.
creation, if you will, a type of new creation on dry land. Well, the Egyptians were not a part of this theming, but yet they tried to follow as if they were. Well, what happens to them? Well, the dry land doesn't apply to them. They're back in chaos,
Yeah.
right? So that's the author's way. That's Moses's way of making sure you understand the importance of the Passover lamb. So now we're tying in the Passover lamb with all this because the memorial of the Passover is going to bring our Passover lamb, which is Jesus, and he's the rock of our salvation. He's the foundation.
Yeah.
Okay, so this all works together. Okay, let's look at another one. In Joshua chapter 3. In Joshua chapter 3 and verse number 14 and 17, this is Israel now crossing the Jordan River. Remember the story? Moses is in charge. Moses has a couple of really faithful guys underneath him, Joshua and Caleb. They're the ones who went and spied out Canaan to see what they could see. There was 12 spies that went, but only 2 of them trusted in God, Joshua and Caleb. The other 10 were like, oh, they're going to kill us. And Joshua and Caleb said, God's giving us the land. They're so big you can't miss. They saw all the positives in it. Oh, look at this great land that God's giving us. So the ungodly generation dies off, but Joshua is the only one from that generation who then graduates out of the ungodly and gets to see the promised land. And now we're going to see a fresh start in Israel's history. We're going into Canaan, into Canaan. And in verse number 14, so it was, chapter 3, verse 14, so it was when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people. And those who bore the ark came to Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest. That's interesting when we have more time. Verse 16, that the waters which came down from upstream stood still, and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zaratan. So interestingly, you have Adam's name, the ark's name, you've got dry land. Look at all this stuff. You have the sea. So the waters, verse 16, so the waters that went down into the sea of Arabah, the salt sea, failed and were cut off. And the people crossed over opposite Jericho. That is to say, they went west. Verse 17, then the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of Jordan. And all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. So that's why the Jordan for us, the Jordan is a picture of original creation of chaos. The Jordan pictures that. So when we see things happen in the Jordan, we should pay attention. Remember, our Lord is baptized in the Jordan River. This idea of ordering the chaos. So here we see this crossing over into the promised land. God's promises again happens through this Jordan River, and dry land is there to remind us of God's ordering over the chaos.
Mm.
All right, let's move on. Second Kings. Second Kings chapter 2. Here's another one. This is a very interesting chapter. This is the story of Elisha taking over for Elijah. Remember, Elisha comes after
Mhm.
Elijah. It's not confusing at all. You just got to remember that. It's very confusing. But if you get that straight, you're doing pretty good. Now, you can read this on your own. It's a very interesting passage. But basically, Elisha does not want Elijah to leave, but he knows that he's going to. And some people are pretty much mocking him for it, saying your master's going to be taken away. He's like, I know they're going to be taken away, but don't keep telling me. Anyways, they get down to the story. If you want to read through it, it's very interesting. But let's just start at verse 6 for the sake of context here. And then Elijah said to him, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me onto the Jordan. In other words, he's telling Elisha, you need to think through this, because the places that I'm going, not safe. But he said that, as Elisha said, as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, I will not leave you. So the two of them went on. Now, usually people would get killed by the Lord for not obeying a prophet. But here Elisha is to take over for Elijah. And Elijah says, you might want to stay here. Elisha's like, over my dead body, man. I'm going wherever you go. And Elijah's like, all right, let's go.
Mm.
He's just making sure he was willing. And in verse number 7, and 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood facing them at a distance, while the two of them stood by. Oh, look where we are. It's the same place the priests crossed over with the ark, and we saw dry ground. Now Elijah took his mantle, that is to say, Elijah took his clothing, his garb that would have recognized him with. He rolled it up and he struck the water. What water? The Jordan. And it was divided this way and that, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. That is to say, it's a fresh start. That is to say, God's presence in the midst of chaos. So we
Mm.
see this theming again and again. These are ways the author is trying to get our attention to say, pay attention. This is a fresh start in the story. This is a new chapter. And certainly when we see this passing from Elijah, Elijah is considered the prophet that represented all the prophets. This is a fresh chapter when we start with Elijah.
Mm.
Let's look at one more.
That's so cool.
Let's look at the book of Jonah. In Jonah chapter 1, this whole thing has to do with what we're talking about. Remember the story? Jonah is a prophet, and the Lord calls Jonah to go and be a blessing to those that are going to eventually kill his family. So, how would you like that for a ministry? Jonah, I want you to go and be a blessing to Assyria. Oh, by the way, also other prophets at this exact same time are saying that Assyria is going to go and take your whole nation captive. The Assyrian captivity, 721 BC, was that when the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, everybody except for Benjamin and Judah and parts of Levi, they're all taken away in the Syrian captivity. And the Lord says to Jonah, I want you to go and be a blessing to them. I'm going to do what? Jonah doesn't want to go. Well, here comes our story. Remember, there's a big storm at sea starting in verse number 4. The Lord sent out a great wind on the sea. Remember what the word wind, remember the ruach in the Hebrew?
Hmm.
Breath, wind, spirit. It's kind of like starting like Genesis 1, isn't it? When the Spirit of God over the face of the deep.
Mm.
Interesting. What are
Yeah.
we about to see? There was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was about to be broken up. Then the mariners were afraid. Hopefully, that's not true for us tonight, for the Seattle Mariners. We're playing the Houston Astros tonight. It's a very important series.
Well,
But
Houston,
anyways,
yeah, but
anyways,
but Houston cheat all the time. They get caught
that's
cheating all the
right.
time.
Amen. Man, I knew you were a man of God. Oh,
Oh,
that's why we call them the Houston Trash Toes. But that's just in the AL West for those of you who are following baseball. Anyways,
yeah,
go Mariners. This isn't them. This is the actual Mariners on the ship. The Mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God. They threw cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load, but Jonah had gone down to the lower parts of the ship and lay down and was fast asleep. By the way, folks, quick question. Does that sound familiar? That sound
seems
familiar?
seems like
A
I
boat?
remember Jesus doing that.
Yeah, exactly. So you have a boat, you have a tempest, you have people that are just absolutely freaking out, and you have some guy that's frankly just fine asleep. Sounds familiar. We'll get into that in a second.
Okay.
So the captain came to him and said, "What do you mean, sleeper? In other words, how can you sleep at a time like this?" Amazing. He says, "Arise and call on your God." Now, notice they helped you out by capitalizing it. But really, what the guy was saying was, we're all calling on all of our gods. Throw yours in the mix, and maybe we'll hit the right one.
Yeah,
Perhaps your God will consider us so that we may not perish. That's a powerful verse, isn't it?
yeah.
Verse 7, and they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots that we may know for whose cause this trouble has come upon us." So they cast lots, it fell on Jonah. In other words, they were saying, we know we're not in control. There's something greater than us in control. Remember, these are Gentiles. These are people that don't have the covenant. Israel was doing a really bad job at representing God. That's what the book of Amos is about. God judges in the book of Amos, he judges Israel for their disobedience to him and their treatment of him. But Amos also says God's judgment on the surrounding nations, not on how they dealt with the Lord, on how they dealt with Israel. So if you can get that order, you'll understand the ministry of Christ so much more because he takes over Israel. He's the Israel of God.
Hmm.
So I know there's a lot there, but that's very true. They said to
Yeah.
him, "Please tell us, for whose cause is this trouble?" Verse 8, trouble upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What's your country? And of what people are you? They want to know all these things. And Jonah answers in verse 9. He says, "I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven." Now look at this, Jimmy, who made the sea and the dry land.
Mm,
Jonah says, "I'll tell you who I am. I'm a follower of the one who can bring order from chaos."
mm,
They're like, "Wait a second. So we're over here yelling at the fire god, and we're over here yelling at the sun god and the god of the harvest and the offspring god. And you know the God of dry land and sea? So it's your fault. He's after you." Well, there's only one God. But these pagans didn't realize that. He just said, "Yep, I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord God of heaven, who made the dry land and sea." So look at verse 10. So then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "Why have you done this?" For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord because he told them. He said, "Look, here's what's happening." Verse 11. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may be calm for us?" For the sea was growing more tempestuous. Now, we know from typology, Jesus uses this about him. That's super easy typology is when Jesus says, "As this was, so am I." Remember the people in Jesus' day, I didn't put this in our notes, but I'll just say it. In Jesus' day, they wanted a sign, and Jesus said, "A wicked generation looks after a sign, seeks after a sign."
mhm.
By the way, Jimmy, our generation is seeking after a sign. That's wicked. You don't need any sign. You need Jesus. We don't need to look for a red heifer. We don't need to look for what's going on in the Middle East. You don't need a sign. You don't need to put out a fleece. You don't need any of those things. A wicked generation seeks after a sign, but we need to have faith in Christ. So we've already been told that. Folks, stop looking for signs. Doesn't matter. Look at Jesus.
But
But
Ken,
Jesus,
signs everywhere. There's signs.
of course there is. Yeah. And people sell fear, don't they? Yeah, and that's how you get wealthy these days. You don't get wealthy from just sharing the goodness of Jesus. If you do it right, you shouldn't be wealthy, but you get wealthy from scaring people. And what did Jesus tell them exactly? What did Jesus say? He said, "Except for the sign of Jonah."
That reminds me, I got a book I just finished. It's gonna come out next week, just in time for the end of the world.
You finished a book?
Yeah, I finished it. It's about the end of the
You,
world.
you wrote it?
Yeah, so hopefully it'll come out in time so I can pay all my bills off before the end.
So this is what's going on in the story. Jesus says, I'm not going to show you a sign except for the sign of Jonah. So what exactly is the sign of Jonah? He doesn't tell us what it is. We have to be familiar enough with the Jonah story to know that what the sign of Jonah is. And I'm reading the story for us right now. Here's the Jonah thing. The Jonah thing is this, that there's a man, because there's trouble in the sea due to his disobedience, they calm the sea by sacrificing him. They throw him in the ocean. Okay, so let's that's first part of the sign.
Wow, that's
So
cool.
Jesus is calming the sea and through his crucifixion. Jesus is thrown into the sea. Who crucified him? The Romans. By what means? Well, because the Jews needed a political favor done. We learn in the book of Revelation that it's the waters, the sea, that the beast rises out of, that you and I looked at. Those are the nations.
Hmm.
So Jesus is thrown to the nations. What happens in Jonah? Let's go on and look at it. So they said in verse 11, what shall we do to you that the sea may be calm for us? Man, that is the gospel right there. What did we do to Jesus that the sea became calm, that the nations were calmed? Do you see it, guys? That's the gospel.
Mm,
For the sea was growing more tempestuous. We're going backwards here in our story. It was supposed to be chaotic waters, Spirit of God comes, dry land appears. But now Jonah's in disobedience. Presence of God leaves, and now the sea is growing more tempestuous. It's the opposite of good
mm.
because God's presence is leaving. Good, verse number 12. He to Jonah's credit, he says to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea. You want to know what Jesus meant when he says, you'll be shown the sign of Jonah? John chapter 2, Jimmy. Tear down this, destroy this temple, and I'll raise it in 3 days.
Yeah.
Pick me up and throw me into the sea.
Mm.
Then the sea will become calm for you. Do
Wow.
you see, folks, why I'm so passionate about no future third temple? You're slapping God in the face. Jesus has become the fulfillment of the old covenant. Full
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah.
So pick me up, throw me into the sea, then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that this great tempest is because of me. Now, in this sense, Jesus, if we're following the sign here, Jesus is saying that he is the last Adam. He's taking on, he's taking on himself the sins of this world, although he was innocent. All right, let's look at verse 13. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to return to the land, but they could not, for the sea continued to grow more tempestuous against them. Now
So
let's
they did.
fast forward
So
this.
they didn't even want to do it.
They did not want to do it. They did not want to do it. They said, "We're going to kill this guy." I mean, it's certain death.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now look at the rest of this. I was going to go to the next. Let's just read on just a little bit here. Therefore, they cried out to the Lord. We pray, O Lord, please do not let us perish for this man's life, and do not charge us with innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done it. As it now, all of a sudden, these guys sound like believers. They're
Yeah.
they're
They do.
talking to they're talking to Jonah's Lord now because they believe that he's the one in charge of this. So they're. And by the way, let's look at this real quick since we're doing the screen share. Let me go into tools real quick. I'm going to go into interlinear. Now look at this, guys. Wherefore they look at this. They, who's the they? That's the people that's the pagans in the boat. So the pagans who were just crying out to all their gods, they cried on to who? No longer is it Elohim, it is Jehovah. Oh, they found out which God was the right God pretty quick here, didn't they?
Hmm.
They cried out to Jehovah. A second ago, they were crying out to the fire god and the fertility god or whatever. They found out Jonah knew the dry land God who lives in heaven, and they became converted immediately. And they're crying out to the covenantal. These are Gentiles now calling out to the covenantal name of Israel's God. That's powerful. Oh
So they.
Lord, please do not.
So. So they had to become like full on believers at that point. How do you?
They
How do you
saw
not?
they saw the purpose of the raging sea. And by the way, just to bring some of our studies together, this is why Jesus used parables, guys. Because if the Romans caught wind of who Jesus was, they never would have crucified him. That's what Paul said in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah.
So he had to kind of use this. You say, why didn't Jesus just come out and say it? Why did he say, there was a certain man long ago, far away country? Why did he talk that way? Because if the Romans got word that this was God manifest in the flesh, they would have worshiped him
Yeah.
and said, this is great. That's why the Roman Empire fell after they realized what they did.
Mm.
Had no more power.
Wow.
Verse 15. So they picked up Jonah, they threw him into the sea, and look what happened. The sea ceased from its raging. The men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice to the Lord and took vows. This is how we would say this today. These guys got saved,
Yeah, they did.
right? And these guys are like, okay, you're in charge. You're in charge of everything. We give you our lives. And they are like, we will live our lives for you. They never seen anything like this.
Mm.
They're like, this Jehovah God, yeah, he's the real deal.
Wow.
Okay, so now check this out. Now the Lord prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah. Oh, we heard about these big fish in Genesis 1. Now he's being consumed by the very thing that we're scared of. He's in the abyss, and the big creature, this whale, great fish. Remember, um, um, what's it called? Carolinus, is that his name? That did the when we talk about different species and different putting things in different categories. Oh, I'm not remembering the name. It's just a tongue twister.
I,
Car-
I only
Carol
I only
Carolinius.
I only went to high school, Ken. Thank
Oh,
you for
well.
reminding me of that.
Well, there's a guy that structured all this. I'm here, let me just look it up while we're talking. We don't need to. Carolinius categories, because I'll get this in my head. I'm just barely saying it wrong. Okay. It's Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus is the one who classified
Oh,
animals.
that's what I
Carl
was.
Linnaeus.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I was putting those two together saying Carol Linnaeus. I don't know. Carl Linnaeus, if you want to look it up. He put these different categories, and then people have done different classifications. It's called Linnaeus's hierarchical or classification system. So if you're reading this and you're saying, wait a second, it says it's a great fish and in Jonah 1:17, but we would say whale today, and fish aren't whales because of the way that we categorize them. Remember, and this was my whole point to this was written far before somebody put them in a different category. If
Mhm.
you're looking at something that's swimming in the ocean, the Bible categorizes that as a fish. That's the broad category of something that swims in the ocean. It's not until later that you can say whether something is a fish or it's technically something different with being, a different kind of amphibious creature
Yeah.
or mammalia and so forth. So anyway, just thought I'd cover that. All right, so going back to the book of Jonah. Jonah, chapter 2, and verse number 1. Jonah 2:1. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly, and he cried, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Now, Sheol is the Hebrew word that is transliterated here. I know the KJV says hell here. Sheol means grave. And so he sees the belly of the whale as certain death. He's crying
Mhm.
out of his grave. He's going to die.
Yeah.
And that is why he's using that word Sheol right there. It means grave. He says, and you heard my voice. Now look at the wording. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me, and your billows and your waves passed over me. Then I said, I have been cast out of your sight. Notice the idea of it being in the deep is out of God's sight. Yet I will look again towards your holy temple. Imagine that. He's looking for the face of God from in the deep, from this creature that swallowed him.
Mm.
The waters surrounded me, even to my soul. The deep closed around me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the moorings of the mountains. He's saying there's mountains on the ocean floor. He's saying I saw these mountains on the ocean floor. That's how far down he is. He's on the bottom of this thing. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. By the way, this is a little side note for our study of the word forever. As in keep the Sabbath forever. Here's a usage of forever that turned out to be 3 days.
Mm.
Because forever here doesn't mean without end. Forever means a time period that you don't know when it's going to end. It's a time period over the horizon of your knowledge.
Mm,
It doesn't mean without end. It means it goes until it can't go anymore. So the
okay.
earth closed its bars behind me forever. What was actually 3 days?
Mm,
But in poetry, he says forever. Yet you have brought up my life from the pit. There's the gospel right there.
mm,
O Lord my God. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer went up to you into your holy temple. So from chaos to temple, that's the ordering. That's why the Holy of Holies is called the Lord's footstool, because he's ordering that section of land wherever the tabernacle was set up. And when he's structuring it with ordering it from the chaos into the holy of holies, that's his footstool. It's his resting place. Remember,
mm.
day 7 wasn't out of exhaustion. Day 7 was ruling over his ordered creation. For those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy. But I will sacrifice to you with voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. Okay, you guys ready for the payoff? You said, I thought we were talking about dry land. So the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto what?
Dry
Dry
land.
land. The end of this nightmare is Jonah's change of heart. A boat full of fishermen are saved. They call on the name of Jehovah, the covenantal name of God. They're Gentiles. They make vows to God, and Jonah returns from this nightmare after 3 days to dry land.
Mm.
This is order from chaos. God's spirit is back. His presence is back. Okay, now let me take you to a familiar story to make this whole thing make sense. Let's go to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4.
You think all these fellers started keeping the law of Moses after that?
Man, I'm telling you, they got in covenant. I'm sure of that. They were like, how do we get on board with this? I think the story doesn't tell us what happens to them specifically, but we do know that the covenant of Moses, the law of Moses, is available to anybody. It's not blood. It's not ethic. It's not ethnic. It is due to your heart condition, your faith. So
Hmm.
that was built in at the base of Mount Sinai. We see a mixed multitude. The majority of them were children from Jacob. They're children of Israel, majority of them. They were
But
all a family,
but
but
there
there
were some
were Gentiles
Egyptians.
mixed in.
There were some Egyptians that
Absolutely.
came with him.
Right. And most of the theming that we see were of Gentiles getting grafted into or put a part of the covenant were prostitutes. Rahab the harlot, for example. She's a type of the bride of Christ, which is
She's
why
a she's in Hebrews 11, isn't she?
she is. She is. That's why we see the woman at the well in John 4 is a type of that Rahab. She's a mixture. She's a Samaritan. She's a mixture between Jew and Gentile, not faithful, and meets the Lord and has her sins forgiven.
Mm,
That's the type of the bride of Christ, because this well typology, we see everybody meets their bride at the well, and she was the type of Jesus' bride, which is us.
yeah.
Okay, verse 35, Mark 4:35. On the same day, now we know this story. We're in the Gospels now, story of Jesus. On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us cross over to the other side. Now, when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was. And other little boats were also with them. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, in other words, he was protected, asleep on a pillow. Sounds like Jonah, doesn't it? Exact same. And they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? Then he arose and they threw him in the water. No, that's not the story, is it? Because there's something different in the new covenant. See, in the old covenant, you were commanded that if you're righteous, you can't touch unrighteous. If you're clean, you can't touch unclean. Because in the old, please get this, folks, in the old covenant, if you're clean in covenant, then the unclean thing will defile you. But in the new covenant, when the clean touches the unclean, it purifies the unclean. Please get that.
Mm,
When Jesus touches the unclean, it doesn't defile him, it makes the unclean clean.
Mm.
Okay? So they didn't throw him in the ocean. He arose and rebuked the wind. And he said, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it you have no faith?" Which, by the way, tells me I control my level of faith. So we have to pray for the Lord to increase our faith. Say, Ken, how do you get faith? Paul tells us. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Get saturated with God's word, get encouraged by him, and your faith will increase. And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be, that even the wind and the seas obey him?" Well, I'm going to close this with just a simple idea of who can this be? Because Isaiah tells us, who can this be? See, in the story of Jonah, they had to throw Jonah into the ocean to satisfy the ocean. Jesus is this new type of Jonah, but he wasn't being disobedient. Isaiah says it this way. Look at this very closely in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 2. Talking about Jesus, "For he," that's Jesus, "shall grow up before him as a tender plant." Now look at the description. Jesus is likened to as simile as a root out of what? A dry ground.
Mm.
So here, this dry ground is in its extreme form. It's a dry ground due to spiritual apathy. This dry ground is political disaster. Israel's not in charge of anything. They're being run by Rome at the time Jesus is born, I mean, and their spiritual light is dim. The temple is used for money laundering, but Jesus is this last Adam. Adam was also born out of the dry ground.
Mm.
So, out of this barrenness where there should not be life, God emptied himself and became humble, even to the fashion of a man. And he humbled himself and was obedient to the Father, even to the point of the death of the cross. So, Jesus is the perfected version of Adam. Jesus was the dry ground. He didn't need to satisfy the ocean. Jesus provided stability in who he was. He didn't need to be sacrificed to the ocean. Jesus was the dry ground. Jesus is stability. He likens it to saying, hey, if you build your house on sand, it's a mistake. You need to build your house on the rock. Who's that rock? Jesus Christ is the rock.
Mm.
He is the rock of offense that will either be something you trip on and get saved, or you'll kick against it the rest of your life and just hurt your foot until it's too late. It's your choice. You ain't going to move him. So what are you going to do with him? This is that word scandalizo in the Greek. It's very scandalous. Jesus is that rock of offense. He's offensive. Of course he is. You
Mm.
can't move him. So you either build on him or kick him the rest of your life. So he's that opposite of chaos. He is dry ground. He is dry land. He is the rock of offense. So we'll build on this in part two when we talk about the abyss or the deep, because they
Yeah.
kind of go hand in hand. But I started getting into that in this one, but I think we'll put a pin in it there, and just so you can see the idea of dry land. Now, I'll just leave you with this thought. This will be its own video too, but we need to do a typology video on mountain, because see, when you have dry land that appears, that's a good thing in the chaos. But then when that dry land then gets bigger and bigger, you have better things. That's a mountain. Dry land maxed out is a mountain. And it's by no mistake that in the Bible, the mountain theme is where the presence of God is. He meets with people on mountains, which is an exaggerated form of dry land. So we'll get into that another time, another video.